She had rehearsed the scene 100 different ways in the ugly mirror of the bathroom at the bookstore, clutching a chipped mug until the ceramic warmed her palms. None of them shortened the distance between her lungs and her pulse. None of them stopped the small, traitorous noise her throat made, like a coin escaping from a pocket, every time she thought about entering a clinic whose fluorescent lights felt like interrogation lamps. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and lemon cleaner. The chairs were a neat sentence of vinyl and steel. A magazine lay face down on a table, as if someone had turned it over to avoid reading the glossy lives of strangers. Sophie Bennett sat with her hands folded on her lap, fingers braided the way she had braided her hair the first time she tried kissing a boy, awkward, hopeful, and inevitably uneven. She had never been touched in the way other people were touched. Not recently, not meaningfully. That ignorance wasn't naive, it was strategic. It had been easier to unread the world, to keep herself a private library where the spine stayed neat and nothing in the margins could bruise. When he walked in, the room rearranged itself around him the way a story rearranges itself when a new chapter begins. Dr. Daniel Hayes moved as if he had been taught how to navigate attention, an economy of gestures, nothing wasted. His coat was tailored in a way that made the fabric look like it had grown on him. He had the sort of hands that imply work, long fingers, confident without being showy. You could tell the kind of person who washed his hands carefully before shaking yours. He smiled with the kind of evenness doctors are trained to offer, the kind that is meant to soothe. It made it worse because there was genuine warmth in it too, like a lamp left on in an empty house. Sophie recognized him before she knew his name. She knew him the way everyone knew a headline, a face familiar from a charity gala photographed beside a patient with a ribbon. Later, she would discover he was a name with articles and plaques, a man whose donations rebuilt wings of hospitals, and whose evening suits were whispered about at fundraisers. Right now, he was only the man whose presence narrowed the room to the sound of her own breathing.
There were anatomical charts in muted blues, a poster about preventative care that hung like an admonition, and a chair like an altar. Sophie sat, breathing at the elbows of her sweater. Daniel moved around the space with an unhurried competence that could have been mistaken for indifference, if not for the careful way he caught her gaze between instructions, as if he were counting the breathing of a child learning to speak. Everything he did was clinical and clean, a choreography of professional distance. He explained what he would do before he did it, the kind of preamble that fills the air with the possibility of consent. He asked permission more than once. He said her name. He was not the kind of doctor who dismissed the politics of vulnerability. But the room was still. Even with his soft, measured talk, it felt like the air tightened around her, like the day someone announced rain and the city answered with a hush. The idea of being held in someone else's trained hands, measured, necessary, made Sophie's stomach, which had been hollow for days, fall into a strange, sinking softness. She imagined each instruction like a fingertip on a map she didn't know how to read. When her breath hitched, he paused immediately. "You're doing great," he said, and extra syllables of the phrase, just a coached warmth, wrapped around her. She wanted to believe him. She wanted eventually to believe it. Instead, panic arrived in a small, precise way, a seizure in the throat that turned her already frail composure into something brittle. Her vision narrowed to the seam of the vinyl chair. She heard a distant voice, like someone speaking from the other side of a glass. The sound of his hand leaving the paper sheet for the doorknob. The light hummed. Someone in a far corner laughed about a show she had never watched. And then she ran. It wasn't cinematic. There was no grand escape or slipping of a heel into a puddle. It was the weight of breath and the clumsy hurry of not thinking. Sophie stood, palms sweating through her sweater, and walked out of the exam room so quickly she left a small thermal imprint of the panic on the seat. She didn't register the nurse's startled look, or the hand that reached, gentle, professional, toward her arm. She barreled through the swinging doors into the bright, sympathetic world of the clinic's corridor and out into the street where the air was cold enough to make her lungs focus again. He watched her go with a quiet look of something like concern, as if he were watching someone whose fall he had not wanted but could already predict was possible. He did not chase. There was an ethics that required distance, a knowledge that pursuit could be another kind of pressure. He told the nurse to give her space, to call if she needed. He sat with the clipboard in his hands and for the first time in a long while rehearsed his words not for reassurance but for containment. Patient autonomy, privacy, doing no harm. Sophie found herself on the steps of a small public library, hands pressed to her temples, trying to collect her scattered thoughts. Her lungs recalibrated, the panic a creature she could now name and distance from. The world smelled of rain and wet stone. Later, when she caught her reflection in a bus window, she would be furious with herself. She had fled like a teenager from a prom, like someone ashamed of basic human need. She had wanted, in some quiet, private place, to be held. Not as a prize, not as a reward, not as something to test whether her existence justified someone else's note in a philanthropic ledger. She wanted what other people had in scenes from movies she only half remembered, a hand that steadied instead of measured. The difference between the two felt to her like the difference between being seen and being chosen. For all his prominence, Daniel didn't make a spectacle. That was the odd part. He sent no messages. He didn't call the clinic twice or ask for the nurse's number and try to find her online. He respected the boundary that had been set by the abrupt end of the appointment. There was a professional code, and he followed it like a compass. Yet he felt a stubborn tug of something else, an interest that had more to do with ached curiosity than with a need to possess. He filed her under vulnerable, not disinterested, requires patience. It was a phrase he would not speak aloud to anyone. It lived instead in the margin notes of his mind. Sophie walked back to the small bookstore she worked at, a place called Lark and Ledger that smelled of old paper and lemon oil. She let herself inside as if it were a refuge built of sentences. The fluorescent lights in the clinic had been surgical, but the bookstore's lamps were forgiving. Amber globes, the kind that made dust look like tiny galaxies. The girl at the counter, Mara, glanced up and then studied Sophie with the particular tenderness you reserve for friends who have been seen in pieces. "You okay?" Mara asked, not loud but very present. Sophie forced a laugh that tasted of pennies. "Fine. Fine." She lied with a competence she had been honing since her mother taught her how to say sorry for things she didn't understand. "Just tired." Mara, who had the soft bluntness of a woman who'd read too many confessions between the covers of mid-century novels, tilted her head. "You sure? You look like you saw a ghost or a very earnest argument about the socioeconomics of tea." Sophie let a smile live on the edge of her mouth. Tea would be preferable. They slipped into the rhythm of small jobs. Sophie shelved new arrivals with a kind of care that felt like petitioning. Arrange the spines in a precise order. Place a particularly battered copy of The Velveteen Rabbit on the window bench where people bought children's books by instinct. Work broke her mind into manageable parts.
People came in and asked for recommendations. She offered them with the shy authority of someone who knew 100 secret worlds, but had not yet dared to step into one for herself. But the city is small for people who are famous in a certain way, and smallness has a way of folding into ordinary streets. A week after the clinic, Sophie was rearranging a table stacked with historical fiction when a man in a crisp wool coat paused just outside the glass window. He looked at the display as if he had timed the light for himself. His reflection overlapped with the mannequin inside, and for an awkward second she thought the world had placed him there intentionally, like a cameo. He stepped in, and the bell over the door chimed in that honest bookstores or houses way. When he leaned forward to look at a copy of a battered edition of Dickinson, Sophie recognized the tilt of his head from that clinic, the same careful measuring of a face before he spoke. She watched him stand in the aisle and choose a volume the way some choose words, slowly, deliberately. "Do you have a copy of The Secret Garden?" he asked at the register, in a voice that felt like a kindness caught and rewound. Sophie blinked. "We do, in children's, over there." Her voice felt smaller than it should have. He smiled, and it wasn't the professional smile, but something softer, like a curtain drawn halfway back to let light into a room. "Thank you. I love the idea of people finding their way back to themselves," he said. And for a breath she felt that the sentence could mean many things, none of them clinical. He paid with a card and left a folded 20 on the counter that wasn't asked for. It sat there, insignificant and incredibly conspicuous. Mara raised an eyebrow. "He left a tip," she said, as if that were a normal thing to do. Sophie wrapped the book and found her hand steadying. She hadn't expected the man from the clinic to make this neighborhood his own. She thought of boundaries and how easily they blurred when someone chose to occupy your periphery without ambiguity. She thought of the things that made her small, the part of her that flinched at attention, the part of her that believed people like him must have reasons to be kind beyond the kindness itself. He came back the next day, and the day after that, always with an excuse that made sense. Charity donors could shop for books for children's wards. an off-day stroll to relearn how to read without a schedule. He spoke about small things, favorite authors, the city's best late-night soup. He asked about her job with a curiosity that didn't feel invasive. How did you get into this? Do you like the smell of old books? Questions no one had asked her in a long time, framed as if they might be the sorts of things she chose, not merely accepted. He listened with a gravity that didn't judge her reticence as a character flaw. It treated it as a nuance. Their exchanges were not long. He never overstepped.
He never asked about the clinic or mentioned her visit. His presence was a series of polite, non-committal meetings that felt, to Sophie, like an unannotated book left open, a promise without a timeline. She told herself she appreciated that. She told herself it was nothing. Then, one evening, when a storm had wrinkled the sky and the city had learned to breathe a little slower, she saw his name in the top left corner of a thick newspaper pushed into the hands of a passerby. Daniel Hayes, philanthropist, opens new maternity wing. The headline made the word philanthropist sound like the name of a church. People stopped to read the piece as though words printed on paper made reality truer. Sophie felt something in her chest thud, a small, embarrassed caution. His wealth didn't change the fact that he'd been gentle in the clinic. It didn't change that he had brought silence into a space where she was used to being ignored. But it did change the way strangers looked at her when she told them, in some later excuse, that she knew him. In their eyes, she could see a shift. She was no longer just Sophie who shelved fiction. She was Sophie who had encountered a man with notoriety. The thought of being interpreted as an opportunity rather than a person tightened her lips. He noticed the moment too, because when she saw his byline in the paper, he looked at her as if to ask permission to explain. "I know what you're thinking," he said softly. "People see the headlines before they see the small things. I can't stop people from making assumptions, Sophie, but I can choose how I act." Sophie had not told him to use her name without invitation. He had heard it that first shy morning. She felt a sudden embarrassment, like someone had walked in on her speaking to herself. The city felt too bright to exist outside of a book. She found herself shrinking into the counter, making herself small in a ritual learned long ago. "Why are you here so much?" she asked, trying to make it sound like curiosity and not something more accusing. He hesitated. There was always that beat of getting the cadence right. "I didn't realize I'd be taken with this part of town," he said. "But I came because Larkin Ledger is a good place. I come because I like the way this light reads poetry." It was not the answer she had expected. It should have been empty, a deflection. Instead, it landed awkwardly like a stone in a shallow pond. She found herself laughing softly, not because his reason was funny, but because the world had given him such a quiet, unremarkable explanation, and she was suddenly desperate for ordinary honesty. Still, the knowledge of his wealth scraped at her. She had grown up with the small, tight world of modest means. Every act of attention from someone like him seemed to carry hidden currencies. There was the fear that she would become a story for people who like to pair lonely women with men who own yachts.
There was the suspicion that someone like him looked at her because she was accessible in ways others were not. He knew this, in parts. He knew that his presence could be a threat, that the city would fold their relationship into gossip and social currency faster than a hand closes in a library. He didn't want to be one of those men whose kindness hid a ledger. So he did the only thing he could decide on that felt honest. He insisted on being small and steady in public. He bought groceries at the corner store. He read on benches. He volunteered at the free clinic's health fair, and when he visited Larkin Ledger, he always asked before bridging professional distance with anything more personal. Their conversations were a slow unwrapping. He told stories about his childhood, less the glossed philanthropy and more about the quieted afternoons when his grandmother taught him to tie knots. He laughed about a ridiculous attempt to make a soufflé once, the kind of laugh that opened him not as a man of means, but as a person prone to domestic disasters. Sophie told him about Mara and their habit of rolling their eyes at tourist maps. She told him about an aunt who believed in saving every postcard, like it was a civic duty. And the more she shared, the more she recoiled in private. It was dishonest to claim the small moments didn't matter. Their gentleness made her ache. It was terrifying to feel seen in places where before she'd curated her invisibility. There was an intimacy in talking about favorite poets that carved a small room in her chest for someone else to enter, and that felt dangerously domestic. One afternoon, as rain tattooed the bookstore window, Sophie found a note tucked inside a paperback of Charlotte Bronte. It wasn't addressed in a clinical way or marked with titles. It said simply, "For the quiet ones who spend their hours making other people's stories readable. Coffee on me, sometime, if you want. D." The note should have been small enough to ignore. Instead, it did what paper always had the power to do. It made things permanent. She slid her thumb over the darkness of the ink as if touch could dissolve context. The note was a polite invitation. It was not a demand. It gave her choice, which was the most important of things. Her internal guard rose anyway. She believed with an almost puritanical certitude that if someone of his standing had affection for her, it would have strings. Her life had not been a stage for others' experiments. She had seen kindness before and traced it back to ulterior motives. She had learned to read the ledger beneath gestures. She wanted to be desired for herself, not for the version of herself who could be a curated accessory in the lives of the wealthy. So she folded the note into the pocket of her cardigan and kept walking. She pretended through several nights and half a dozen shifts at Larkin Ledger that the edges of the paper sang a lullaby she could not translate.
At the same time, there was a part of her that liked the thought of the invitation because it came without expectation, because it respected the possibility of a refusal. There was even a braver corner that imagined she might one day accept. Daniel, in turn, felt each small refusal as a gentle correction. He did not believe in coercion, in the slow erosion of a person's agency through more persistent attention. His father had taught him to use resources to protect others, not to regionally dominate them. He'd been raised with the belief that wealth was a responsibility first, a luxury second. It showed in the way he navigated their tentative acquaintance, with patience rather than proclamation. When he saw the way she watched others with curiosity, a man buying books for his kids, a couple choosing volumes with the sort of deliberateness that felt like a marriage rehearsal, he began to fold himself into the periphery of her life, as if he were learning a new confidence. There were small chapters that felt like growth. The first time she willingly took a coffee he offered and didn't feel the ground tilt beneath her. The first night they spoke beyond the hours when customers were present. The first time she told him a real, untidy story about her childhood dog, and he didn't try to psychoanalyze it into a metaphor. He listened. He leaned into her sentences the way readers lean toward an engaging passage. He never tried to press the page closed. Yet there were moments of which she was keenly aware. He was a doctor, and he was a man whose life allowed him privileges. As far as she was concerned, that combination could produce pressure, even when none was intended. He never suggested that his status could do anything for her. He never promised things. He didn't offer to pay rent or to lift the concrete weight of her financial anxiety. What he offered was a steadiness, a presence that wasn't performative. And yet small appearances nearly wrecked her. Once, when a friend asked her out for a beer and mentioned that the doctor from Larkin Ledger had been seen at the gallery next door, Sophie felt the old fear. How would she be read? Raise its ugly head. She wanted to be a decision in herself, not evidence that a rich man had glanced in a bookstore and made room for her. "Why are you so interrupted by this?" Mara asked one night as they closed. They stacked chairs and whispered like conspirators. "He left tea bags yesterday. He literally left chamomile sachets for the break room. Who does that and means nothing?" Sophie shrugged. Return of the veteran skeptic. Maybe he does it because he likes the tea. Mara flipped a light switch and the shop exhaled into darkness, except for the street lamps that made the display window glow like a lit stage. "Or he likes you," Mara said like she was stating an inconvenient fact. Sophie replied with a dry little smile. "Maybe he likes the idea of me." It was easier to laugh, to shelter in sarcasm. Better to make a joke than to admit that the arousal of being wanted was not a thing she could be practiced at. Desire had always felt like a foreign policy she couldn't manage. As autumn turned the city into a pageant of russet, Sophie found her life more tangled than she had imagined. The bookstore was a refuge and, paradoxically, a new public place where she was more visible than she had ever wanted to be. Daniel's visits were regular without being possessive. He read at the corner table sometimes, a stack of medical journals and poetry both within reach, a man comfortable straddling two worlds. People would sometimes glance and whisper about the mismatched pair, the quiet bookseller and the famous doctor who donated to hospitals. The narrative in other people's mouths made her cheeks burn. The narrative in her heart was different. It was less about what others might say and more about the way his presence loosened a knot she had not known existed in her chest. It wasn't a crystalline rom-com realization. It was a gradual thaw, measured in footnotes and small shared silences.
And yet she retreated as often as she came forward. She built little barriers like the ones she had learned in childhood. Lists, routines, a compulsion to fold fitted sheets perfectly because it meant at least one corner of her life was under control. One afternoon, Daniel asked if she'd like to host a reading night at the bookstore. He promised to bring a few people who cared about local literature, the kind of crowd that would buy a paperback and linger to discuss marginals. Sophie agreed, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps because she was tired of giving in to the reflex of saying no. The night of the reading, the store filled halfway with neighbors and people who loved words the way some people love guitars. Daniel arrived early and helped Sophie arrange chairs. There was a practical lightness to the way he picked up a box and set it down, like someone who knew how to move the weight of things without making an announcement. When a woman asked him about his work, he deflected to the subject of care in language that was almost reverent. Between readings, Sophie moved through the aisle serving hot tea in paper cups. When she passed him, he caught her wrist with a touch that was so accidental it might have been a mistake. It steadied her. It meant nothing, and it meant a great deal, perhaps precisely because it was ephemeral and unclaimed. She looked at him and saw in his eyes a steadiness that was not a command. On the way home that night, as the city emptied into a hush of wet leaves and passing trams, she clutched her cardigan tight. There was a small, quiet conversation in her head, one that kept repeating the same terrifying thought. What if she let someone in, and they left a note that read her wrong? She slept poorly that night. She woke with the knowledge that she was walking on a narrow path. She also woke with a sense of something else, curiosity.
There was a tiny rush of wanting to test whether the warmth she felt in his presence was reciprocal and safe, or merely the ghost of a larger, detached generosity she had sometimes read about in articles about men of wealth. Then, as if reality required a counterweight to the gentle building of proximity, Sophie had a day at work when the weight of everything caught up. Her shifts had become longer. The bookstore, beloved as it was, paid in modest numbers and never in relief. She had not slept properly in a week and had skipped meals because she could not manage both the anxiety and the appetite at the same time. The city had been more crowded and less forgiving. She felt the world slip at the edges, the small tremor before a storm. It began as a dizziness, a moment where the shelves seemed to tilt and the light above looked too bright. She placed a hand on the nearest shelf to steady herself. The smell of dust and lemon became a hand over her mouth. People continued to shop, oblivious. Mara was rearranging a display at the front of the store. A child laughed in the children's corner. The world continued to make itself real for others while searching her for a reason to stop. Sophie took another step and felt the sudden vertigo that makes everything beyond the next breath irrelevant. She had kept herself together until this moment by calculation alone. Schedule, list, purpose. All the small scaffolds she built to keep herself from being seen took on the weight of an old scaffolding that might at any moment groan and collapse. She grabbed the counter. Her fingers shook with such a familiar private tremor she wanted to laugh because it felt absurd to be undone by exhaustion. The room narrowed into a tunnel whose end was a lightless point. For a second she had the naked sensation of a needle withdrawing from skin, one acute, bright sensation, followed by ringing muffled like underwater bells. She tried to call for Mara, but her voice was a swallowed echo. The edge of consciousness arrived like an oncoming train. A cough somewhere cleared the air. A tray clinked on the counter. The lights began to blur. Sophie tried to place a thought, any thought that would anchor her. Breathe, count, think about the chipped mug from the bookstore break room. But thought was a rope that had been sheared. Her knees gave. She had never been touched, not in the way the world might imagine, but she knew with the bizarre clarity of someone who has always written the margins of their life that if she went down here, someone would have to catch her. She had spent years practicing the art of landing softly on nothing. This was different. This was the kind of fall that required another person's hand to make it less final. As her vision softened and the edges of the bookstore became watercolor, she saw Mara's silhouette moving toward her, urgent and bright. I heard voices, someone asking if she was okay, someone telling her to breathe. The air smelled suddenly of chamomile, which made no sense because she hadn't had tea. She thought, absurdly, of the note folded in her cardigan pocket. She reached for it, fingers fumbling, and felt paper, and then the world was a soft blur, and she experienced the sensation of being carried forward like a story turning a page. She didn't know how long she was out. She woke to a ceiling that was not the bookstore's, but a softer, more neutral light. The beeping of a monitor threaded through the space around her, and there was a fret of movement, people whose faces were both nearby and oddly out of reach. Her first thought was not logical. It was a small, brittle worry about dignity, about not being a burden. And then she saw him. He was a silhouette at the periphery of everything, his profile unmistakable even in the fluorescent blandness of an urgent care room. For a long instant, she thought she must still be dreaming. The rational mind keeps filing events. She had collapsed and someone had called help. Daniel, if he'd been nearby, might have been present because of the reading night, because he'd seen Mara's call, because the city folds people into strange practical patterns. But the way he moved, swift, steady, had the kind of motion that suggested he had made himself smaller so he could be useful. He did not approach like a man claiming ownership. He came forward as if he were making a careful step into a private scene, balancing a line between connectedness and clinical distance. His eyes were wide, and something like worry traced the line from his eyebrows to his jaw. He looked at her with an attention that was terrifying in its unmannered focus because she was unpracticed at being the center of such care. "Sophie?" His voice was the same as the first day, steady, but underneath it was something that trembled, human and raw. He didn't reach for her without asking. There was a medical reflex to his motion, a check of a pulse, a tilt of the head. But there was also something else, a hand hesitating, then landing on her shoulder as if to anchor a boat. That touch, brief, unobtrusive, practical, sent a bolt through her that was not merely physical. It was unfamiliar because her life had been orchestrated to prevent such contact. It was shocking for the simplicity of its intent. It wasn't romantic in the way novels describe kisses with the sun in the background. It was an instrument, the hand of someone who knew how to study a body. But to Sophie, with years of practiced solitude and a heart that knew better than to hope, it felt like something momentous. There was a clarity in the moment that pierced through the sedation of fainting. The touch was not an intrusion, it was an offering. There was no ledger beneath it, there was no calculation, only a human hand placed where a human being needed being studied. He looked at her properly then, no shields, no titles. "You're going to be okay," he said simply, and in this simple statement there was an absence of assumptions. He didn't claim to fix anything he couldn't. He offered a fact. You are okay now. The sentence was small and efficient, and for reasons that had nothing to do with the physical mechanics of recovery, it shocked her. It shocked her because she had never in her life felt the world respond to her in such an undramatic, conscientious way. It shocked her because she had always assumed that when other people reached out, it was to get something. It shocked her because the touch, a professional, steadying hand on her shoulder, did something inside her that nothing else had managed. It pried open a small space where trust could begin to settle like a sheet. He remained at the edge of her awareness as nurses checked vitals, and as someone wrapped her in a blanket. He did not use the moment to ask for more, to demand reciprocity. He stayed because being present was the only question he allowed himself to answer. He had been taught to help people in crisis, but in that quiet hospital room, the boundaries that had separated their fates felt less rigid. The professional and the personal overlapped, not in a way that erased ethics, but that complicated them. Sophie, who had fled a week earlier from the idea of being touched in a clinical setting, felt her body betray her again with an odd need, to be steadied, to be visible, to allow the fact of her vulnerability to exist without being judged. She found herself watching the way his hand hovered near her, the careful posture of a man learning how to be involved without commandeering. He watched too, with the kind of attention that meant something larger. He didn't know yet how to translate that attention into words a person like her wouldn't find invasive. He didn't know how to tell her that he admired the way she had built a life out of small, determined acts. He didn't know how to explain that he had a terrible habit of rescuing in ways that were both helpful and dangerous. For now, all he could do was be close enough without crowding, an art in itself. The beeping of the monitor kept a steady tempo like a metronome, and the room was small and ordinary, and perfect in its ordinariness. Sophie watched him as if from under a glass, and when his hand brushed the paper of her note in his coat pocket, the one she had folded away in the belief that some invitations are better unaccepted, there was a small private exchange of paper and intent. She realized in a new, frightening way that being seen had consequences that were both tender and complex. She didn't know what would come from this moment. She couldn't have named the future even if someone had asked her to, but she felt a fracture in the armor she'd built, a gentle shattering in which the pieces felt for once like they might be put back together with something other than stubbornness, with care, with choice, with time.
When the nurses settled her in and wrapped the blanket snug under her chin,
Sophie thought of the note in her cardigan pocket, the one that asked her to choose coffee if she wanted. She thought of the way his hand had steadied her, the most ordinary first touch, and realized with a small, alarmed happiness that it had done something to the shape of her expectations. Outside the soft room, rain made the city an indifferent smear of light. Inside, under the patient hum of fluorescent bulbs, two people occupied a place that was both professional and, quietly, complete, careful, present. The sentence hung there between them like breath held and slowly released. Nurses moved with quiet efficiency, voices low and practical. A warm blanket tucked under Sophie's chin, a paper cup of water at her lips. Someone murmured that her blood sugar had been low, that exhaustion does funny, sharp things to a person. Details landed around her and she let them. It felt safe to let them. Daniel stayed where he had been, near the foot of the bed, but not too near, like a lighthouse that offered guidance without drawing ships onto the rocks. He watched the monitors with the same attention he'd shown in the clinic, but his eyes kept pulling back to her face. There was an urge in him to do something more, take her hand, press her palm with a thumb until the tremor passed, but the professional line between them was a taut wire he had no wish to fray. "I'm going to step out and speak with the nurse about transferring care," he said finally, in a voice that carried both the calm of his training and the awkwardness of a man doing what his conscience told him to do. "If it's okay with you, I'll make sure someone follows up." Sophie blinked, the hospital light mapping little stars across her vision. For a long breath, she could only nod. The thought of him walking away felt like both relief and loss. Relief because there would be no unspoken obligations tethering her to him. Loss because she had felt in that brief touch something like recognition she'd never allowed herself to hope for. He left the room with the same economy of motion he'd displayed in the clinic, efficient, unobtrusive. When he spoke with the nurse in the hallway, Sophie heard only fragments, names, a quick plan to contact her regular GP, and offer to arrange follow-up care at a community clinic. He told the nurse he would not be taking an active role in her care, that maintaining professional boundaries was paramount. That last sentence landed heavily, like a promise dressed as procedure. She slept and woke and slept again over the next 24 hours. Friends texted, small messages filled with worry and jokes that wanted to mask real concern. Mara arrived with fresh clothes, a thermos of tea, and a look that said she was not leaving without making sure Sophie could stand on her own 2 feet. The world slowed to the ordinary chores of recovery: rest, water, gentle meals.
It was dully miraculous, Sophie thought, how the body insisted on mundane acts like proof of life. On the second morning, Daniel came to the bedside with a cup of chamomile, the same tea that had seemed impossibly intimate when left on the bookstore counter, and an envelope folded into the side pocket of his coat. He paused in the doorway and measured the scene. A woman who looked paler than she had any right to be, a nurse with a concerned crease at the brow, a city sky like wet pewter outside the window. "Ms. Bennett," he said softly, "how are you feeling?" "A little less like a pincushion," she managed, and there was a small, private humor in it that had nothing to do with the machines. "Thank you for—" She stopped, because she didn't know whether she should thank him for coming or for leaving, for the touch on her shoulder or for the distance he had maintained afterward. He set the cup down on the bedside table with careful fingers. "I wanted to make sure you had what you needed," he said, "and I wanted to be transparent. I requested that another physician follow your care. I can volunteer information about the incident if you want it, but I won't be your treating doctor. I think that's the most ethical thing to do." The words landed like small stones that steadied rather than uprooted. Sophie felt a wash of something like gratitude, complex, bright, and laced with fear. "I appreciate that," she said, the sentence a bridge she had not expected to build just then. He lingered at the edge of the room, not taking the chair beside her. "If there's anything I can do as a friend, if you want to ride home when they're ready, if you want someone to pick up prescriptions, I'll do it, but only if you want, and only after the right steps are taken." It was the permission embedded in his offer that mattered more than the offer itself.
a refusal to create a debt, a refusal to use his influence to fold her life into his. Sophie recognized the respect in that as plainly as she recognized the steadying of his hand earlier. There was a care in his leaving that matched the care in his staying. Both were forms of attention. She let him go with a minimal nod. Later, when the paperwork was final and the hospital discharged her into Mara's steady arms and a cab that smelled faintly of disinfectant, Sophie walked out with one practical instruction taped to her bag. Follow up with your GP in 2 days. No grand declarations. No signatures that demanded personal futures. If this quiet, aching story is the kind of thing that moves you, like and subscribe to follow Sophie and Daniel's slow, honest unfolding. Outside, the city breathed in gray. Daniel stayed back at the hospital for a meeting with the nurse, and then, true to his word, he stepped into his life like a man who had closed a door properly. He did not slip under its frame to peep at what remained.
For Sophie, the hours afterward were filled with ordinary recovery, soup the color of warm milk, naps that unspooled like thread, a comfort in the predictable edges of home. They emailed once in the weeks that followed, short messages that carry the new rules like talismans. He checked in to ask if she had made her follow-up appointment. She sent a photograph of the bookstore window with a little caption about a ridiculous display gone rogue. They both kept it casual, cautious. Their lives, previously punctured by a moment of emergency, began to reassume a skyline of distance. Months in the life of two people who have learned to move with intention can be a very particular measure. For Sophie, time was stitched together out of shifts at Larkin Ledger and afternoons where she allowed herself the small, dangerous pleasure of walking in the light. For Daniel, it was the kind of caution that comes from having learned lessons the hard way. He had loved once with a fervor that had backfired, had trusted a familiarity that turned out to have been mercenary. He had vowed afterward to protect the vulnerable parts of other people, not to possess them. They encountered each other again in ways that respected the changes. Daniel no longer arrived at the bookstore with the same quiet frequency he'd once managed. Instead, he appeared with careful intention. An RSVP left weeks in advance, a volunteer shift at the free clinic where he wasn't on a podium but folding bandages and listening. When he sat in the corner of the bookstore now, he did so on equal footing, a man reading, not a man performing generosity for an audience. Sophie found that she could measure his steadiness by small things. He arrived on time. He kept plans he made. He didn't show up with gifts meant to impress. He accepted no without recalculating. He was present in a way that did not seek to own. That steadiness, more than eloquent speeches or grand gestures, became the slow architecture of trust. The confessions that finally came were not cinematic. They arrived in a kitchen where the kettle steamed and the light was the forgiving sort that doesn't lie. Sophie had invited him to her apartment to thank him for an article he had quietly arranged to bring extra copies of to the shop, an old local paper that did profiles on small businesses. She had been nervous to ask him and astonished when he came. They sat at her wobbly table with thrifted mugs between them. It felt new and honest and small. Daniel told her about his childhood, about a grandfather who taught him how to mend fishing nets, about a first marriage that had withered under secrets and unshared debts. He said it without oversharing, with that economy again, enough to understand why he had once been reckless with trust. I was hurt in ways that made me start measuring value differently, he said, voice low. It made me cautious in a way that wasn't justice for the people I wanted to care for. Sophie listened.
She had never wanted to be anyone's project, but listening to someone own their faults without theatrical penance appealed to the part of her that believed in second chances administered with humility. When it was her turn, she hesitated, then unfolded a story that prickled like a splinter. She spoke of a childhood where being unseen was safer than being noticed, of a mother who had been practical about love, of nights when she was convinced the world would be easier if she took up less space. She told him about the ledger she'd kept in her head, where every kindness had an equal and opposite expectation. He reached across the table then and laid his hand flat against hers. There was no sudden surge. This was a decision in motion. Consent given, consent accepted. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I don't want to be a person who takes advantage of fear. I want to be someone who helps you feel like you have room to breathe." She laughed, a small, incredulous sound that warmed the kitchen. "Sometimes I think breathing is an extreme sport," she said. He smiled, and in that smile there was none of the professional polish that had made her nervous at first. It was the face of a man who had chosen to be known,
not as a benefactor or a headline, but as a human being. From there, the relationship slid forward on an axis of incremental consent. They dated, if that is the right word, by mutual agreement rather than by any dramatic break in status. He had officially transferred his involvement in her healthcare, and she had seen the documents that bore it out. It mattered to her that there be paperwork as well as words. They kept clarity as a kind of fidelity. Their first kiss was not at midnight under a city light or in a film-ready rain. It was on an afternoon when autumn had given the town a crunchy carpet of leaves, and they'd been sharing a bench in a park after a market. They had eaten slices of a warm, unimaginative pie and laughed at a dog that insisted on wagging himself into people's backs. Sophie had been telling a story about a clerk who once insisted that all books be shelved by weight rather than author. Daniel, listening, leaned so close that his shoulder brushed hers. She looked up at him then, really looked, and felt the same oracle that had worked in Hospital Touch. Competent, human, real. There was no ambiguity between them now. Every touch had been preceded by 100 small clarities. "May I?" he asked, a question that was both a courtesy and ceremony. "Yes," she breathed. Their lips met like the closing of a book, deliberate, soft, something that had existed in drafts now finally being printed. It was a kiss that respected the fatigue of old wounds and the freshness of curiosity. Afterwards they sat with their foreheads touching, and the delicate sound of their breath saying, without words, "We chose this." Months blended into small rituals.
Saturday mornings were for farmers markets and overcooked eggs at a tiny diner. Wednesday evenings were for book clubs that Sophie organized, and Daniel attended with a sheepish love of marginalia. They stitched a life out of ordinary things. A pot of basil on the windowsill, a Sunday walk that involved neither conquest nor competition, long phone calls that ended in confessions about things no one else would hear. There were tests. An ex-girlfriend of Daniel's, an old affair of accounts rather than hearts, resurfaced in a news article that tried awkwardly to pair him with another philanthropist. Sophie had a moment of suspicion so quick and sharp it tasted metallic. She read the headline as if it were a physical bruise. Daniel called her within the hour, straightforward and unflinching, to explain the context, and the ways he had never asked her to rewrite her world for his convenience. They argued once, for the first and only time that left marks. It was about charity and the difference between help and spectacle. Sophie, who had grown up on practical economies, bristled at headline philanthropy and at the way people could layer good intentions over self-congratulation. Daniel, who had spent adult years funding wings and programs, defended his choices with earnestness that bordered on obstinacy. "You still have to tell me when I cross a line," he said, later, when the heat had cooled to an ember. "I will not assume my way is the way. And you have to see that sometimes small, steady things matter more than a check," she replied. "It's not that I resent generosity. I just want to know what it's buying." He listened. He did not win the argument. He took notes the way people used to take notes in apologizing, with attention. That was the pattern between them, mistakes and repair. Each repair stitched slower and more carefully than the last. It was not always pretty, but it was honest. Their choice became a compound verb, choose again and again, and in that repetition, trust built. The culminating scene came on a day soft with spring. Larkin Ledger had a new window display, and Sophie was rearranging spines with the sort of deliberation she reserved for important meals. The cafe across the street had a tiny sign taped to the window, announcing a local author reading. It was one of those days when the city felt like a hand reaching for your own. Daniel had asked her to meet him at the cafe after work. He told her nothing else, and that lack of information felt for once like an offering rather than a deprivation. She closed the shop and walked the familiar 5 blocks, the evening layered in yellows. He was already there, sitting at a table near the back, wearing an unfushy shirt and an expression that betrayed both excitement and nerves, an odd combination for a man who had given speeches to hospital boards and read names aloud in ceremonial halls. He stood when he saw her and came with, again, that measured step.
He sat without theatrics and reached into his coat. This time it was not a card or a folded note. He produced a small, plain ring in a box that did not sparkle like a headline, but shone with the promise of being chosen. There was no band of diamonds, no grand pronouncement. He opened the box with fingers that trembled slightly. "Sophie," he said, "we have been very careful with words and boundaries and with being honest when we were wrong. I want to keep being careful in all the good ways. I want to ask, plainly, will you marry me?" Her initial shock had nothing to do with the ring. It had everything to do with the gravity of the request. Years of building a life meant that a question like that was not an answer to loneliness.